Greetings ladies and mental gents, and welcome to my channel, where I like to make audio narrations of various stories from the internet. In this video, we will be focusing on a story from the subreddit HFY, called The Trash Jumpers, written by Regal Legal Eagle. A link to the original will be in the description down below. And, as always, I hope that you enjoy. Elder Thantis sat on the edge of the meeting hill, looking out over the river valley below. The large campfire that he always remembered as a child crackled and snapped behind him. But the canvas tents had been replaced by a stone and marble. Indeed, his people's homes had grown greatly since the fateful day so long ago. They had a real city now, streets, houses, and a small but growing library. His people were no longer just farmers. They could do and be whatever they wanted with their lives. The field stretched out as far as the eye could see, and the harvest was almost up in them, and he could see that a few of the tenders wandering out there, the light of the twin moons holding true and dark at bay. Past the fields were the trash mountains. Although they hadn't had much trash in a long time, the young ones simply called them the Bone Hills, since they looked like the bones of a pheasant that had been picked clean by scavengers. But to Thantis, they would always be the trash mountains. He looked up then, in the clear night sky, at the large white blue moon, Feck, and his younger sister, the pale purple Ress. Stretching out along the sky, however, were the trash rings, the remains of an ancient battle that happened long before his time. The battle had been brought to the trash jumpers here. Behind him, he heard the hushed tones, and looked over his shoulder to see the herd of children looking his way and whispering. One was out in front, seemingly ready to build up the courage to talk to him. Thantis decided just to make it easy on them. The elder grumbled a bit and rose up, letting his forelegs stretch out from underneath him, using his power of the upper hands to push a little. He was getting old, but he wasn't helpless yet. His long, shaggy mane remained simple and unfettered by the styles and trinkets the kids these days liked to weave into their own. The children grasped as he approached. A giant even amongst his own kind, he wandered closer to the warmth of the fire, and then he settled back down on his legs. He looked around the group of children, who were all hushed and yet obviously wanted to ask. He knew their parents, and filled their little heads with lies about his great deeds through his life. Everyone seemed to think that he was a hero, and all he had ever done was break the old laws. The laws about never hurting a living creature. The oldest and most sacred of their vows when he was young. He never liked those stories, but there was a story he did like. So, young ones, do you want to hear a story of the trash jumpers? They clambered up then, excitement alight in their eyes as they shouted and agreed in a varied tones depending on how much they'd heard before. He took a deep breath and rumbled out softly as he looked back over the fields, out towards the trash mountains. Do you know why we used to call those the trash mountains? He asked, pointing with one of his 3 fingers. It used to be covered in a trash elder, but one day it was all stolen. Stolen? He turned back with a huff as the children skittered back. It was taken, but it was not stolen. It was trash. It was not ours because we never gave it a second thought. No, it was not stolen. And what do you all know of our people? How we came here? Another young one piped up. We were brought here to make food. Yes, we were. And who brought us here? The red ones. Thantis chuckled at that, his deep baritone rumbling across the crackling fire. Yes, the red ones. Although we called them the Anatlets and their empire, they brought us here well before my time. They told us to farm, and every month they'd return to take most of what we made. Every half a solar cycle, they'd wait for us to leave our special ceremony to claim our elders as meat. Their children gasped at that, since likely they hadn't been told that part yet. To spare them nightmares, well, that made them soft in Thanatis's thinking. Needed to let them know the real history. That's right, if I had been my age back then, I would have been meat for their bellies before 15 solar cycles ago. But even our elders allowed it. It was the way of the things they said. They gladly traded their lives for our continued peace on this planet. It was a simple life. Farm, gather, and wait to be eaten by the Anatleds. We lived in tents made of simple canvas, twine, and sticks, not these fancy buildings you all enjoy today. But we were not alone on this planet. There was also the trash jumpers. He looked back out over the moonlit fields once more to the mountains beyond. We never knew their names. They were small, energetic. They lived in the trash and would always be seen jumping over it. So that was their name, the trash jumpers. He pointed out at the sky to the rings of trash held in the sky by some unknown force. That was the remains of a great fleet that they had once possessed. They lost, but the survivors rained down on the planet with trash. Generations ago they waited until the annelids brought us here, thinking this planet secure. Then they started to return. We had no idea what they were doing out there. To us, their lives were short and strange. He mused over his thoughts, thinking back to his own childhood. They could grow much. They had to live in the mountains and hide from the Red Ones, as you call them. So they'd venture down here to our homes and trade with us. I didn't understand why my elders would want trash, but I learned that it wasn't just trash. There were trinkets and valuables and little bits of tech that we grew much food. So we were happy to trade. I remember seeing some trash fall out of the sky, hitting the plains of the south, and it made a big hole. There was something shiny and valuable looking at the bottom. But the elders told us to let the trash jumpers get to it. The trash from the skies were dangerous, and indeed, when the trash jumpers tried to claim it that night, there was an explosion from the hole. I didn't understand why they would kill themselves, or at least risk death over trash. He rumbled, and a little of he shook his head. But one glorious night when I was young. Oh, that night. He smiled, looking up at the sky, thinking back on it. Then he pointed over towards the mountains. We saw a light rising up out of the trash. It was glorious, and shot up towards the heavens on a pillar of fire. But before it reached the sky, it exploded. He roared out and startled the children, who gasped and shifted, his hands expanding out to emphasize it. I realized that's what they were doing with the trash. They were building something to reach the skies. Well, I figured after that night that they were done, and it hadn't worked. But that didn't stop them. More trash fell from the skies, and 2 weeks after the first attempt, we saw another pillar of fire rise up. Well, this one made it. He pointed up at the trash rings. We saw it rise up and vanish into the sky itself. The next day, more trash than ever rained down upon the plains. We didn't think about it at the time, but very little rained down on our fields. When I first pointed this out to the elders, they thought that it was simple luck. I know now that it wasn't luck. It was the trash jumpers. They didn't want to harm us on accident. Better to hurt themselves. He shrugged his broad shoulders for a moment. The annelids returned the next time on one of their many ships. It moved much more quietly than the pillars of fire that the trash jumpers had. They were tall creatures like us, very angular, claws, teeth. He pantomimed the features for the children as he spoke. They were hunters, and mean ones. One of the elders tried to tell them about the pillars of fire, but they didn't believe him. They were insulted at his attempts to spare himself from the ceremony and butchered him on the spot. Thanatos shivered as a little as he thought back to that night on the meeting hill, only feet away from where he sat now. After that, we didn't tell the annelids anything about the trash jumpers. They claimed more of our elders and left, and they always picked the smartest amongst them as well. They wanted us to never stray from our task of farming after all. But the trash dumpers soon returned from their hiding holes in the trash, and we saw more pillars of fire soon once a night, then twice a night. And a week after that, we didn't see any more pillars of fire. Instead, we saw streaks of light. But there were more explosions during all of this time. Not all of the journeys were successful. I don't know how many of them died each week, but they never stopped. He rubbed his chin slowly. And then one day my mother and sister fell ill. It was the grey mold. Some of the food we had to grow for just the annelids could get this strange fungus. It would take 2 or 3 days, but anyone who had it growing on them would die. The new elders told me that it was simply the way of life. They'd die, and be set aflame to spare the rest of the herd. Slowly, he shook his head and pointed back out towards the mountains. But I knew that the trash jumpers didn't think that way. I disobeyed our elders. I snuck into the tent they'd sealed up around my mother and sister. I collected some of the fungus, and I went in search of the trash jumpers. Make no mistake, I was risking being thrown from the herd, and marked an outcast. To venture beyond the valley was a grave offense back then. He thought back to that night. The fields were far larger than they looked like before that. He walked and walked and walked, and it seemed to take all night, but he finally reached the edge of the trash mountains. He looked back at the children to fill them in on his thoughts. Back when ours really were the trash mountains, they were covered in metal, jagged, sharp pieces mostly. It was a treacherous climbing up those hills. We weren't made for it. We're made for the plains. I cut myself many times, but I kept climbing up higher and higher. And then one of them found me. I remember seeing the cave in the distance, partially covered by a giant sheet of metal. I was covered in cuts and bleeding from many places when the light and no fire shined in my eyes. There were 3 trash jumpers, 2 of them males and 1 of their females. They had short hair, simple clothing held tight to their body, and only 2 legs. They seemed small. So small. He sighed out as he remembered the first real encounter. In the past he'd seen them from a distance, trading with the elders, that he'd never met them face to face. I begged with them, pleaded, holding out a sample of fungus. I told them I had nothing to give, but I asked for their help. They didn't even hesitate. They brought me into the cave. One of their males helped bandage my cuts, while the female prepared some sort of salve after examining the fungus in the strange metal box. I asked them what I must do to repay them. How could I have ever lived down the debt that they had over me? He smiled, thinking back. They told me that I had no debt. We fed them, and it was their debt to us. I, of course, insisted that I owed them, but they gave me some water and escorted me back down the mountain, showing me where to travel so that I wouldn't get more cuts. Once I was back in the plains, I ran home. I had been traveling all night, but I ran. I was exhausted and pouring sweat, but I made it, and I didn't acknowledge the guard and the elders that had set up around my mother's and sister's tent since I broke in. I rushed past him and gave them the salve and the trash jumpers had given me. His smile grew into a full-blown grin, and it worked. The fungus fell off of them. They were weak, but they were alive. Of course, I had disobeyed the elders, but they understood why. Instead of banishing me, they assigned me for 2 months of hard labor in the fields. I didn't mind. I was strong, and it only made me stronger. I began to explore the fields and the plains more. I hoped that the trash jumpers might visit, but they were busy at night. Slowly his grin faded, and he shook his head. Then came that faithful night. The annelids returned for the ceremony, when a piece of trash fell from the sky bigger than I'd ever seen before, right into the fields. They were surprised, but I convinced them that it was nothing. I had worked in the fields more than anyone, and I told them that it happened from time to time. Nothing to worry about. They seemed to believe me, aside from one. He kept looking out over the meeting hill, and he watched the field as I watched him. As the night drew on, he must have seen something, because he turned and pointed at me, telling me to guide him out there. Thantis sighed. I had no choice. I had hoped the trash jumpers were already gone when we got there. I moved slowly until he jabbed me with a talon, cutting my side, demanding that I move faster. I was scared, so I moved faster. And when we got to the hole that the trash jumpers were still there, it was the 3 who had helped me, and they were still crawling over some bigger piece that looked important. Then the annelid. Thantis became silent as he closed his eyes, and he thought back to the 2 males. He remembered their screams. The female was struck in the side and wounded, but not dead. He remembered the antlered, red and angry. Get to my kin, I will torture this one and skin the others as trophies. It seems that you are not lying about the pillars of fire. You will be rewarded. I looked into her eyes, that fear and anger. Thantis had always been taught to never harm another living creature. His people were peaceful. They ate plants, they farmed, they let themselves be sacrificed. But an anger welled up within him, and that he'd never known. He punched the creature, and heard a surprise as it staggered, his mighty fist slamming into it again, driving it to the ground before he reared up on his hind legs and stomped on it. He remembered shaking with fear and guilt right after. The anger had faded, leaving him feeling sick. The mighty Thantis nearly pissed himself with regret. His herd would have abandoned him, not just banished him. They'd chase him from their lands to die alone. Slowly, taking a breath, he looked back at the kids before him, waiting for his story to continue. I killed the antlered, and I crushed him beneath my mighty hooves. But only after he had slain 2 of the trash jumpers. I'd been weak and hesitant. I'll never forgive myself, but I picked up the injured female and told me to grab part of the trash, and I ran. I carried her up to the mountains and up. I was hasty and suffered many more cuts, but I brought her to her home, and there were more trash jumpers this time, but they were in metal suits made of trash that I didn't understand at the time. They spoke in their own language, often looking at me, covered in my blood and some of the antlers on my front legs. They seemed to make up their minds. They escorted me back down to the fields and to my home. There were about 30 of them on those trash chutes. They told me that they were going to attack the antlers and stop the ceremony. I couldn't believe it, but of course I agreed to help. Since our town was just tents and canvas back then, there wasn't really any place to hide them, so I just had to guide them along the quickest path to the meeting hall. There were only 9 or so antlers left there, and one that I had crushed. We were peaceful and never fought back. Why would they need more of the crew for their ship? The trash jumpers charged up at the meeting hill, but the antlers saw, and bolts of lightning struck several of them down. But I was faster and knocked one of the antlers down again. The trash jumpers had their own bolts of lightning, and the trash suits, and while many of them fell, the antlers were slain. He shook his head, thinking back on that night. The herd stared at me in horror. What had I done? I had killed a living creature, twice now, and I had angered our keepers, and brought these trash jumpers into our home, to the very meeting hill. But one of the trash jumpers explained that they would protect us now, and we wouldn't be meat for our captors. It sounded too good to be true for many, who were scared about the return of the antlers, but I was spared abandonment that night. He smiled then. But then the next day the trash jumpers showed their true progress. They flew the antlered ship into the sky, and we saw all of the pillars of fire and streaks of light launch at once. There had to be 100. Then they returned in the biggest ship that I had ever seen. It was larger than the very city, wings stretched out and made of black and white. Not true white, however. It was scarred and scratched and old and worn from being in the sky for too long. It was massive, and the trash jumpers brought it down and swarmed over it, fitting trash from the mountains to the outside. And, for the first time, we saw the other ships. Shaking his head, he chuckled softly. They were much like I expected from the trash jumpers. The other ships were trash, chunks and hunks of this and that, stuck together however they fit. I thought that they had some ancient vessels that were simply old and dangerous. But no, they had made them from the scratch, slapping them together and likely praying that they would work. Then they had all launched into the sky at once. Pillars of fire, streaks of light, and a massive bone of white mountain. A flying trash mountain now, up, into the sky. He sighed once more as he thought about it. The next night the sky was on fire, explosions, flames, lightning streaking through this trash. It was a spectacle that I had never seen the likes of since. And the morning after, the trash mountain returned, and it was belching smoke and missing pieces, and many of the other trash jumpers' ships did not return. But there were no annelids. The remains of the battle rained down on our fields, the plains, and the mountains. But the trash jumpers no longer hid. They swarmed out all over it, patching together their flying trash mountain, making more ships, using everything that they had. It took another month before the mountains were bare, the bone hills you see them now. He grew silent then, thinking back on it. He had been afraid to talk to the trash jumpers after his failure to save the 2 males. But the female sought him out and asked him to come see the trash mountain. He begged for forgiveness that she once more said that it was her debt to him, not the other way around. He had walked with her out to the flying trash mountains as she spoke. We appreciate everything you and your people have done for us, but we need to go to the skies now. We will hunt the annelids, and we will find more of our own, and we will burn the empire to the ground. You're leaving. You're all leaving. But what will we do? You mean you'll just leave us here? Why won't you take us with you? Take you with us? No. We go in search of war and strife. You stay here. This planet is yours now. Live in peace. One day, when the annelids are no longer a threat, we will return to you in peace. But you get to live your lives however you want now. No one will threaten you. Thantis was shocked and sad at the same time. He couldn't believe that the trash jumpers felt so indebted for the bits of food that the elders didn't want. You and your trash mountain honor us. I'll make sure my people always know of our shared debt. Food for peace is a very small price. Us and our what? Your trash mountain that flies. He waved his giant ship above them. She looked up and laughed. The memory of that laugh made him smile as he stared at the fire. The next day the trash jumpers left. The side of their ship had painted on it now, and it read, Trash Mountain. What happened, Alda? One of the children asked as he looked up and remembered where he'd left off. They left us, and they flew into the stars to find the annelids and defeat them, to protect us and any like us from being used as food and slaves for their evil. And one day they'll return, and we will give them as much food as we possibly can, even if they tell us we don't need to, because they gave us freedom. Your parents have become writers, builders, stonemasons, artists, craftsmen. They have become whatever they want. Even we collect trash now, trying to learn from it like they did, thanks to the trash jumpers who traded trash for food, and built an army, and a fleet out of the junk and the remains to challenge the galaxy's mightiest empire. But how do you know that they're still out there, Elder? You haven't seen them since you left. Because, young one, it has been 200 solar cycles. I am old and weary, but the annelids have not returned. If the foe was able to build a fleet from little old trash, imagine what they would be able to achieve with all the new trash that they made by destroying the annelids. They're up there somewhere, and while my friends might be gone, I can only pray that our offspring live on, so that I may thank them one last time. He looked up at the sky, watching a streak brush across the sky as another piece of trash fell down from the heavens. And that concludes the story. If you enjoyed this story and wish to support the author, the link is down below. If you would like to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so. They will also be listed in the description down below. But the easiest way to help this channel is to share it, subscribe, and like. And, as always, I will see you all in the next video, and I hope that you have a good one. Cheers!